for joining us. And if you're having any trouble with your audio, please do put that into the chat or the questions window. Today we are going to be going through the GDPR and the credit union, applicability and alignment webinar, what credit unions need to know about GDPR and its applicability to its operations. So today's agenda, we are going to go quickly through introductions here. We're going to go through an overview of NCU ISAO, overview of GDPR and US-based companies, requirements affecting IT and security teams, as well as some GD preparation, key priorities to go through. And throughout the webinar, to keep it a little bit more dynamic, if you have any questions, please do put it into the questions pane here, and we will try to address those as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we will plan to leave a little bit of time at the end to handle those as well. Okay, well, you are listening to David Grazer. I am the practice lead for privacy and vendor management over here at Tevora. We are a management consulting firm focusing on the business of information security. And I am joined by Brian Hinsey of NCU ISAO, who is the VP of Member Services.
Hey, good morning, David. Thank you.
Got it. So Brian, I know you wanted to go through a little bit of an introduction to the ISAO, so I'm going to let you take over.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. If you could go back to one, oh, this is fine. This slide's just fine. Yeah, so welcome everybody and good morning and officially afternoon to those on the East Coast. My name is Brian Hinsey. I'm VP of Member Services and Operations here at the NCU ISAO. Pretty much the main point of contact for our members and potential members as they interact with the organization, learn about the organization, join the organization. You know, first off, I'd actually like to take a second to thank Tevora. Tevora has been there and supporting us through events really since we started about 18 months ago, and now, you know, through webinars like this, supporting us through member education as subject matter experts. So thank you very much for putting this together and for taking such a big topic and focusing it down on credit unions. Our organization was founded in 2016. We are an ISAO, which is Information Sharing Analysis Organization. There was legislation passed at the end of 15 called the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, and it really expanded legislation that was put in place after the founding of Department of Homeland Security post 9/11, and it broadened the government's role in supporting the private sector and nonprofit organizations like ours to stand up information sharing in more specific and focused sectors. So us understanding that credit unions have unique needs, they're not for profit, they report to a single regulator in the NCUA specifically when we talk about from the government level, and that they generally have limited staff and some of these other challenges that we find is pervasive within the credit union space. We wanted an organization that was focused on credit union resilience and specifically focused on those unique needs. So from a value proposition standpoint, I wanted to kind of tell you how this specific topic came about and where it kind of fits. So of course, we're an information sharing organization, but for those on the call, you're here for some insights into this, this operational and regulatory guidance. So that can take place from our working groups. We have a handful of working groups, one of which is regulatory compliance, webinars like this one, regulatory guidance. We have a cyber incident response exercise taking place next week. So this topic really fits right there in the middle. And GDPR kind of came up amongst our membership, not only in some focus groups we had prior to our conference, but also Tevora presenting to some of our members and non-members who attended our annual conference earlier this year. And since then, I've gotten some questions from some prospective members and actually members still looking for more insight into the topic, understanding applicability, enforceability for that matter, and trying to identify how it would impact their credit union further. So we circled back to Tevora after they did such a great job at our conference and said, hey, folks are still seeking information on this. Can you do a presentation? We understand it's looming, it's right around the corner, but if those questions are out there, then there's going to be organizations who still want to better understand how it could apply to them. And in doing so, I'm seeking to better understand the topic as well and how it applies to our credit union members, and for prospective members out there who may be considering participation in the organization, and for in looking at the attendee list, I see we definitely have some of our members on the call as well. You know, where we go from here as a member-led organization, truly a member-led organization focused on the real-world issues that our credit unions are seeing, is going to be indicated quite largely by the Q&A and some of the challenges and issues that you guys throw out and some of your concerns during this interactive session and this webinar. You know, and where we go from there may be, you know, more in-depth education like this. It may be a focused working group, maybe it piggybacks nicely on one of our existing working groups, but you know, that's how this will really ultimately benefit members of the NCU ISAO, is us, you know, presenting information like this, understanding the issues, and being able to better understand what we can do to assist in connecting our credit union members together, and ultimately helping everyone with, you know, cyber resilience, and in this case, you know, regulatory compliance around this information sharing and this data privacy issue. So with that said, if you don't mind just moving forward for me, David, I'll wrap up my little piece here. No, I don't have control. Did we have the contact slide in there? If we didn't, that's okay.
Oh, I put it at the end there, Brian. My apologies.
Okay, well, my contact information will show up later here. So if you're somebody that we haven't connected with yet, love to tell you a little bit more about the organization, about some of the opportunities to engage in working groups like our regulatory compliance group, and those types of things. Otherwise, probably the quickest way is just go to ncuisao.org. In the upper right, you'll see a membership tab. Click on there, you can get a little bit more information and actually send us a contact form, and we'll reach back out to you and set up a time to talk. So with that said, I'm done. Again, thanks to Tevora for presenting us with this great information, and go ahead, David.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Brian. And again, thanks everyone for joining this morning and afternoon. And again, if you do have questions, like Brian said, we do want to keep this as dynamic as we possibly can. So please do feel free to hit me up with some questions, and we can address those as kind of we get through here. One of the big things when it comes to GDPR and US-based companies and credit unions specifically today is that GDPR should not only be seen as a data protection regulation, but also it's going to have an effect on global economics, trade, and innovation. And if you've read pieces of the regulation, you can kind of see how that could be the appropriate interpretation. First things first is, what I really wanted to address is how Tevora as an organization sees privacy and how to approach not just GDPR compliance or alignment, but privacy in general in this day and age. It's a trending and impactful topic. So starting to position your organization in terms of privacy, being privacy forward, privacy by design, which we'll go into a little bit further, is only going to be beneficial and a strategic advantage to you as well as your members. So at Tevora, we see privacy really as cross-functional. It's deeply strategic. It informs your security and your data protection strategy, as well as I said, it can be an advantage rather than just an additional process layer that some may think it would be. So our approach is really to look at it from a holistic and a cross-functional standpoint. You'll see that throughout the presentation today. That's the way that we like to get people thinking about this, not just solely compliance, but risk-based and a strategic risk perspective. And we look at privacy and risk as the drivers of your security and data protection. And we believe that a solid privacy team, as we've said, is cross-functional. So it's really built upon legal, security, and business units. Everyone has a part to play. So first thing I really wanted to hit on here is that GDPR is really about unification and harmonization of protecting personal data across the European Union for European data subjects. So really what is considered personal data? So GDPR really, it's helped to expand the definition of personal data So it includes, multiple categories, including financial data, first and last names, IP addresses, geolocation information, even political party membership, trade union membership, and then there's what they call special categories of information. So we have ethnic origin, biometric data, personal health information. So as some of those pieces continue to advance, we're going to see that. So, like we said here on the slide, it's really anything that identifies an individual, from a person's name to telephone number, date of birth as well, and photographs. So there's a lot there.
And David, got a question. Are email addresses considered personal information as well?
They are. Yep. Even which is a unique. It's a great question, Brian. Uniquely, even emails that are provided on the corporate domain are still considered personal information underneath GDPR. So it's just a unique little spin there. And at the European level, we have the Data Protection Directive and the Directive on Privacy and Electronic Communications. And these are really what GDPR is stemmed from. So really what I wanted to go over here is, for most of us at this point, we've heard GDPR. We continue to hear about these acronyms. We've heard about them for a long time at this point. So it stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's the regulatory evolution, like I was stating, from the Data Protection Directive. It supersedes the U.S. Department of Commerce's Safe Harbor Agreement that was negotiated between the EU and Department of Commerce. And it really is about providing comprehensive regulation on protection of data privacy for EU citizens and residents. And it was crafted by the EU Commission, as well as, and then will be overseen by a supervisory authority or an enforcement authority in each EU member state once it goes into enforcement. One piece to note is that the UK, even with Brexit, has now announced it will comply with GDPR, and it will align to what its intents are, its objectives. And it goes into effect in 11 days at this point, about 11 days. And there is considered no grace period. That is really just because the regulations the full rhetoric or legislation letter actually came out in 2016. So in the eyes of the Commission and the data protection authorities, this has been rolling out for a number of days at this point. So one of the other big things, we want to talk on a couple key points just to kind of be aware of. So you're starting to hear a lot of information about key pieces of GDPR, one of which is the data protection officer, as well as the registration of an on-the-ground representative. If your business is, a core piece of your business is to process EU citizen data, then you would be required to appoint a data protection officer. If not, then you would be able to enact what's called a virtual data protection officer. So someone who comes in and helps potentially on a retainer type basis, and they would help you navigate to compliance and work with the supervisory authorities on behalf of your organization. There's also what's called the right to erasure, also known as the right to be forgotten, and that is really the ability for an EU data subject to come to any organization and request their information to be removed. There are some legal exceptions to that if you have a regulatory requirement that you must maintain this information. If removing this information could impede on freedom of speech or could be harmful to individuals within the EU, then you do have a legal exception and wouldn't necessarily have to erase that information. this is obviously a bit of a confliction with some of our regulations here in the U.S., as I said. And one of the other pieces is that really what GDPR is doing is it's moving from more of an opt-out consent and data collection flow to an opt-in design. So that is something that a lot of organizations are starting to deal with. You need to gain clear consent before you're actually able to collect the information on an EU data subject. So it's very different than the way that we've always approached it in the United States. But it's one thing to make sure that you keep in mind when you're looking at this. So, and as most of us are now really leveraging the cloud in some way, shape, or form to deliver services, you will need to ensure that you do have a good understanding of where that data does reside, what that data is, and why it is critical to your business. We'll get into it a little bit later, but data controllers and data processors both have obligations under GDPR. So understanding how your cloud infrastructures are architected, if they're in use, and the matrix of responsibility for that data is going to be important, as well as understanding that there are different levels or thresholds and strict requirements within the regulations. So if you are an organization that collects a lot of information on German data subjects or even Spanish or French data subjects, the regulation gives a little bit of leeway to each member state to enforce certain pieces of it a little bit more strict than others would. So a lot of the guidance has been from from our partners, our legal partners, as well as a variety of industry experts as well, is that it's best and more strategic to actually align to some of these stricter thresholds rather than having to adjust how you are going to control and protect that data if you come into contact with those thresholds moving forward. So it's just something to keep in mind there.
David, before you move on,
yeah.
if you go back to the prior slide, just got a question from the audience on applicability. The question
Sure.
was, does it apply to more than just EU citizens? So for example, a US citizen that is in the European Union, does it apply to them?
Yes, it does. It applies to actual residents. So if you're a resident of an EU member state, it does apply. There are protections. It's supposed to protect their data as well.
Okay.
As well as a citizen in the United States as well, an EU citizen within the United States.
Perfect.
Okay, so just a kind of a top level summary here. So, fines, part of the reason that it's such an important regulation to at least assess and understand if you are in scope for it is that fines can be up to 4% of your annual global revenue. So for some major organizations, this could be billions of dollars, just depending on what the potential infraction is. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind as you're assessing the applicability of it. The cloud infrastructure is definitely going to make GDPR a little bit more complicated. As you can imagine, it's a little bit more interconnected than it ever has been. And you do have what are called, under Articles 40 and 42, there are call-outs of what are called codes of conduct or certifications. So there are certain industries that are going to be building up their own frameworks to align with GDPR, which will make it a little bit easier for organizations serving these subjects to adhere to the GDPR and its intent and controls. So the one that we're calling out right there is the cloud service providers. Some of the bigger names in the EU are going to be doing this. They have not necessarily launched just yet, but we do expect that to be a way to align a lot easier. And just to remember that the intent is about controlling personal information. It's about someone to own their own control of the data that they are providing. And it's just good for companies to keep in mind that the United States actually does not have what's deemed an adequacy decision. We are defined as a third country, which means that the Data Protection Authority, as of yet, has not deemed that we have appropriate privacy controls or regulations in place. So that is why you are seeing certain model clauses or different or other different means of being able to certify that there is legal transport of data outside of the EU. And then remember that the scope is not solely focused on transferring data outside of those boundaries. If you do provide a good or service, you conduct a business with an EU data subject, then you are required to comply with GDPR. Okay, so kind of piggybacking on this piece, is GDPR really applicable to a credit union? So if your services are accessible to an EU data subject, either abroad or domestically, the answer is yes, then you will really need to look at alignment to GDPR to comply with its intent, as well as if there's a potential that in EU data subjects data does reside within your environment, then you should really look at stepping through some alignment to GDPR. So one of the big things is that there is arguments across the board about what is deemed offering goods and services. That's really the big scoping call out. But it's really just good to keep in mind that at its core, GDPR is really about best practices. So regardless of your need to comply with GDPR, just applying some of these aspects, privacy by design, only maintaining and collecting the information that you need for, a true business responsibility or business need, is a real way for a credit union to, strategically stand out, have an advantage, and it could be to your members' advantage as well because you're taking their privacy seriously. And as we talked about, it is such a hot topic that anything that does deem an organization taking that into account is not a bad thing. Okay, so what I wanted to do next was kind of step into some of the requirements that are affecting security and IT programs. We already touched on them a little bit, and I'm not going to go into an extreme amount of detail here, but just want to kind of to talk about them. So the first one is Article 17. So that's the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten. So remember that unless it is impeding on the freedom of expression, it creates an issue with public health information, scientific, historical research, or any legal claims, like we talked about then. Without undue delay, you are supposed to remove all the data of the data subject upon that request. Articles 7 and 25 are really about the opt-in and the privacy by design. So really that's just making sure that you are gaining appropriate consent, proportional, which is a unique word that they use in the legislation. Basically that if you're collecting the data for one reason, only process data for that reason or a reason that is in alignment with the original intent that you did collect the information. And if that is not the case, then you would need to go out and obtain consent for an additional service potentially, or something of that nature. So just making sure that you do have those consent flows in place to understand why you're grabbing that information, and if you don't, potentially not collecting it. One of the other ones that is going to really push on the operational elements and processes of an IT or security team is going to be the breach notification. At this point, you are, as the controller, really required to notify the data protection authority within 72 hours of confirmation of an incident. Now, we're going to see if that timeline really hits, and if it really stands. That is, as I'm sure a lot of you know, that is a tough turnaround from confirmation of an incident to that notification piece. But that is one that continues to be talked about and is going to be a point of focus for the data protection authorities. So making sure that you do, with your processors, your third party, have an agreement in place that states that we do need to comply. We are trying to align to GDPR. That you would need them to notify you immediately if they believe that a breach has occurred, so that you can then go through your due diligence to notify the authorities. And then the other one is the data protection officer, which we talked about. So that's in Article 37. So if you, like I stated previously, if it is a core activity of your business to process the personal data of an EU data subject, then it's going to be a requirement or something to truly assess to have a full-time data protection officer in-house. Otherwise, you will be able to utilize what's called virtual data protection officer, someone who comes in and works with you on a very specific basis, has an understanding of your organization, and really helps you to kind of build up and out a privacy program. In our opinion, not just to align to GDPR, but also to just align to general privacy best practices in our digital economy. So again, you're going to need to just look at these requirements as a company and how you could potentially comply with them, and really what your needs are as an organization. The notification timelines will require some assurance of some operational feasibility there for your company. And the consent provisions are going to compel organizations to really evaluate the way that our consent mechanisms are designed at this point. It's going to be a little taxing technically to solely focus on redesigning opt-in for potential EU data subjects to hit this. So potentially looking at creating transparency within your privacy notices and the way that you are collecting information is really going to be a real advantage moving forward. Okay, and a couple other pieces, and we'll get into these a little bit later as well. But so data mapping, data classification, and data minimization are really core pieces of GDPR. Without understanding where your data is, how it flows within your environment, you can't truly classify it or even minimize it. So making sure that you do have an up-to-date data inventory, that you continue to go through any data mapping processes to ensure that you have an understanding of what's being collected and why, is going to continue to be one of the best ways to maintain and stay in alignment with GDPR. There's also what are called privacy impact assessments or PIAs, which we'll talk about. Those are talked about in Articles 35, 42, and 43. But really, what we're looking at here is, implementing more of a risk-based approach to data protection, and making sure that you have an understanding and go through a process of we're launching this new website or this new service into these areas. What are the potential privacy implications, here in the United States as well as abroad? And then what are the controls that we can put in place to protect that information? As you can kind of see, that's really just that's good hygiene. That's just a strong best practice to kind of protect your infrastructure and your data and your business, just in general. So again, you can kind of see those as the undertow there of GDPR. And then one of the other key areas is going to be vendor management. So vendors, really within the legislation, you'll hear the word processor a lot, processors and controllers. In this case, the credit union would be the controller of the data. The processor would be if you have any third party that helps support the processing of that information, or if it's a cloud provider, infrastructure provider, whatever it may be. Both those entities have obligations. A lot of those obligations align to the incident response piece, the notification aspects. So really just having understanding of what information each of your third parties or your vendors have, as well as how they're protecting information and they're staying in alignment with the requirements that you do, is going to be key. So that's going to be really looking to build out a strong and mature vendor management program moving forward. And again, those are pieces that you can continue to evolve, not just try to hit for the May 25th deadline. It's just solid best practices. And then one of the other unique pieces is that GDPR is calling for the ability to do continuous monitoring and reporting, or what they deem a record of processing activities. So that is actually how you would ensure that what type of information is being collected and processed for each EU data subject. The data subject does have the right to ask for those records, to potentially have them updated, just a simple address change or name change or whatever it could be. Or that could be the lead in to them asking for their information to be removed. I just wanted to check here and see if we have any questions. Perfect. Okay, so this is a good question regarding consent on an online member application. So it's a great question. So one of the big pieces for the opt-in consent is making sure that the boxes are not pre-checked. That's a big thing. So consent could be simply someone making an update to a browser setting. It could be them checking that box. But really, from all the literature that continues to come out and all the guidance, really what we're looking to kind of create is just an ecosystem of transparency around what data is being collected and to why, and then giving the individual the option to really opt in to the collection or having a true understanding of what is being collected. So that's a solid proactive piece, is just making sure that your privacy notices can be understood by all ages that would be potentially utilizing your services, and allowing people an understanding that they need to check that box or accept for that information to be collected. Okay. Moving on here. Okay, so now I just wanted to kind of go into some preparation pieces, some key things. So we've talked about it, but one of the one of the best exercises or initiatives anyone can go through at this point is really a data mapping exercise. So really going through, and we advise, especially within this time limit, to really start going after consumer-facing systems as well as regulatory-facing systems, gaining an understanding into what information you are collecting and why, and then looking at what type of protections you have in place or controls you have in place to protect that information. So that helps. So going through this data mapping is going to really enable you to output a data inventory that you can then use to conduct what is what I alluded to, the privacy impact assessment. You really want to move through this process continuously. There are tools out there. It's a new landscape that continues to evolve that helps to do data mapping and data discovery, but that really is just helping you automate the types of information. And they have become so robust and comprehensive that they're actually going to allow you to classify data for a variety of types of requirements that you may have here domestically as well as abroad potentially. You know, and the privacy impact assessment, or the PIA, you know, it's really looking at those privacy risks. So again, you're hearing terms like, you know, risk and risk-based, because that is really what we're trying to do here. What GDPR at its core is looking at the protection and doing that through a risk-based approach, not just compliance. That's really what we're looking and we're seeing kind of as a trend. And I think we're going to continue to see that not just with GDPR, but with some of the other regulations that are going to pop up around the globe, and maybe even something domestically at some point. Who knows? But again, best practices and kind of getting into that risk management mindset, I think, is going to really enable strong environments and enable you to really utilize the data you have to your strategic advantage.
David, there was a question. There's actually a couple of them. One was a follow-up on applicability that piggybacks on citizens of the EU. This particular question is, if they don't offer memberships in the EU, but a member either moves or visits the EU and keeps their membership, does that affect the requirement of GDPR for the entire credit union?
It's a good question. And I think, unfortunately, that's one we're going to have to kind of see. You know, if they are living within that area and they are still potentially getting a goods or service by the letter, the interpretation is yes. But I think the big thing for, you know, at least us, you know, Tevora as an organization and a variety of our partners as well, is that, you know, I'll go back again to the best practice piece, that it's going to be an interesting journey, I think, to potentially scope out your applicability to GDPR. So it's best to potentially just start adopting pieces of the legislation that you can start to implement these, you know, more privacy by design approaches, doing, you know, annual risk assessment, keeping an up-to-date data inventory, because that's just going to make it so that becomes less of a concentration as to whether or not we're truly applicable, and focused more on, we know that we're collecting the amount of information we need to provide the services that we need to our members, rather than having to worry about a potential you know, legal battle or legal incident potentially. That would be the best guidance that we would give on that.
Yeah, and on that note, does it make a difference if they're military and stationed in the EU versus non-military or private citizen?
There are again, I think because if you're talking about a military base, I think we're going to have to see kind of how they end up dealing with that. I think there is going to be a potential difference, but yeah, I mean, I think there will be a potential difference, but I think we're just going to have to continue to wait and see how some of these pieces evolve. Again, the enforcement doesn't hit for another 11 days, and I think after that we're going to start seeing certain use cases. But I think that there will be some ways to address that. But again, making sure that that information is still protected is going to be key. And if you're on bases potentially around the globe, just quickly, I was going to touch on this a little bit later, but Japan, Australia, Canada, a few other evolving regulations, even in Latin America, are looking to GDPR as somewhat of a framework for data protection. So kind of just having an understanding of what the intents are and how they are shaking out intent-wise, I think is going to really put an organization on more of a proactive stance rather than reactive if they do have to start addressing some of these controls moving forward.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then just on a note on the prior slide, we had another question on regarding mapping and whether or not it includes electronic and paper assets.
It does. It does. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But again, they would also have, that's a great question. They would have different types of controls in place to protect it. And hopefully there is what we recommend, and, we'll kind of get into it, in a slide ahead here, but, there's kind of an analog and a digital approach to kind of identifying what type of data you have. So that helps to kind of grab both what could be paper or more analog based, we'll call it, as well as digital based, to get a very comprehensive vision of what your inventory is. So just kind of hitting on these pieces right here, the quick primer on a PIA. So really what GDPR is asking is for you to conduct this, prior to really the processing of any data that could be deemed sensitive, in areas of an organization where you could be making a decision or constructing a profile on an individual to potentially market a new service or provide some type of medical therapy or whatever that could be, where publicly accessible areas are being monitored. That is a big piece, as well as when a public authority is launching a larger platform for processing data. These privacy assessments should, if you are building out your own software, you should look into building these assessments into your software development lifecycle. That's the SDLC there. That's really that privacy by design, getting it really embedded into the real foundation of how things are being established and constructed. It should be, when you're implementing any new initiative that comes up that would be collecting data, really really deemed sensitive information, right? As well as the due diligence process. If you're going through an M&A activity, it's good to do that. And then it kind of goes back to if you're doing this, when you're doing a security review, or even what we would call a privacy review for your vendors, your third parties, that can be in your vendor, your procurement process. It's just a good time to go through that, understand what data they would have, what their responsibilities are for protecting it versus you. And then overarchingly, it's really about doing this annual risk assessment that includes, privacy as well as security to really understand what you are, what your potential risks are surrounding data.
So a follow-up on that, David, then is what can you do in the eyes of GDPR to make data anonymized?
What can you do to make it anonymized? I mean, there's a few ways of doing that. I mean, there are some, scripts and pieces that you can compile and write that strip away certain aspects, as well as putting into place encryption. So encryption it's talked about. It's not a requirement of GDPR, and I think there is some language out there on the internet that says that it is. It's not necessarily. It's a way to mitigate potential risks. So say there's an incident where an EU data subject information could have been exfiltrated. If that data is encrypted, the risk level to the individual is actually much less. So under GDPR, that is a way that you would still have to notify the authority, but you wouldn't necessarily have to notify the data subjects, which is a helpful piece just in managing that potential incident response, as well as potentially protecting any type of brand equity, membership protection, whatever that could be. But yeah, those are one of the ways, as well as what they call they call it pseudonymization, big fancy term that they created. Really just creating pseudonyms for individuals that make it more difficult to correlate the information, correlate particular information to a specific individual, is another way to help anonymize that information. So these are just 4 kind of pieces that I wanted to touch on here for the overarching privacy impact. So the first thing is you want to make sure that you are defining that data mapping process, that you're doing data identification and socialization. You're trying to understand how that data is actually what it is and how it's used. You want to be continuously improving the data life cycle, making sure that you're not just taking in data to take in data. There's always the term garbage in, garbage out. So in our opinion, taking in good, clean data is always going to be beneficial to an organization. And that is kind of then done through having real strong data minimization and purging processes. So understanding that I maybe don't need to take this piece of information, and I just don't collect that at all, or I purge information, particularly certain categories of information, on a more at a more rapid pace. You also, we're talking about applicability a lot here, so we want to understand where the data does reside. Now that could be just the residence of the individual, where they're from, if they're an EU data subject or not, as well as just what systems it does exist in. That goes back to the vendor management piece of things as well. Again, you want to make sure that you know that you want to identify if you are collecting that sensitive information. That's what you're going to do through that data mapping process. And then you want to compile all of this output that enables you to then go through and step through those risk assessments to understand what controls are in place, and how you're going to continually address the protection of the data. So, and you've heard me say this a lot, but this data mapping process and keeping an up-to-date data inventory is really going to be a real game changer and very strategic for certain organizations. It's going to be extremely helpful. And you want to also understand that the PIA is not really, none of this is supposed to be a contentious activity. Sometimes when you go to certain departments, they may be a little weary to kind of give you the keys to the kingdom. But really what this is it enables you to identify and understand what's there. And if you approach it with care and understanding that that each function has a reason and objective to why they need that data, you keep that in mind, and you really just are able to start identifying the champions, your privacy and security champions, because if you're not just telling them, well, you can't do this because I told you and we have to apply to this specific regulation, you're starting to really engender trust, and really that's going to transform the way that the organization looks at privacy and security, as not just a compliance mechanism, but a way to protect members and provide, just industry-leading services to them. Okay. So these are just a few, tips from the field when it comes to stepping through this process. Give yourself time. It can take some time to do it, but just make sure that, you start to phase in that approach. You focus on certain aspects. You focus on more consumer-facing systems to begin with, then you focus on regulatory-facing systems, and then you can go throughout the organization. Like some of the questions have asked, you want to go old school versus new school. You kind of want to have the digital, the data discovery tools as much as you can, as well as implementing good old-fashioned interviews, talking to those individuals within the organization, gaining a real, building that trust, and establishing a rapport that enables them to say, hey, we need to collect this information for this reason. And you also want to speak broadly. Don't just speak technically. Create that connection across the aisle. So it's not just legal and IT. It's legal and IT and security and your business units. That's where the privacy champions are going to be created. And also don't be afraid to use available resources. A great framework is ISO 22307 that kind of helps you step through those privacy impact assessments. And there's just a few more slides. I know we only have a few more minutes, so I just want to kind of touch on these. We are going to be sending this in a PDF, so you will have this information to look at a little closer. But, we are looking at about 11 days. About only 20% are really looking to be able to fully comply. So again, this is a phased approach. As long as you're taking the steps, establishing, doing a data inventory and starting to create any policies or what have you that help protect that information, that's going to be, real key and crucial and look good in the eyes of any protection authority. Last slide. So, there are really 5 key big advantages that I think that GDPR gives any organization, and it's you start looking and establishing this privacy by design. Consumers, members are starting to want this more and more. They want to know that their data is being protected. It enables you to really create partnerships within the organization and outside of it, particularly even with your third parties. Data minimization forces you to truly understand what is absolutely necessary to do and to meet the initiatives that we have in place and that we're looking to implement that are on our roadmap. It's really forward-looking security. It's proactive. And most importantly, I think for the group that we're speaking with today is it's about member protection. It's about protecting your members, their privacy, and ensuring that they feel confident in being able to utilize all the wonderful services that you all offer to them. And with that, I will open it up to any questions, and I will leave it on the membership information page that Brian spoke about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yeah, I've been kind of monitoring the questions here, as you know, David. So just to kind of keep it in order of what we've got here, there are a few here to wrap up the day. One is, how is existing consent affected going forward as of May 25th?
That's an awesome question. So the way it'll work is consent, it's not retroactive. So if you've gained consent previously, you're going to be okay with that information. You're just going to need to make sure that you are protecting it. Moving forward, if potentially there is a need to run some type of new processing piece, you're going to have to gain some type of consent on that information, whether or not you've gained it previously. What we're starting to see, and what I've seen a lot, is organizations are kind of using they're going out with a broad scale campaign to gain consent from all users, and they're utilizing that to promote their new privacy notices, their new protection controls, and just use it as a real branding opportunity to kind of gain some real continue to engender that trust in protecting data. So that is one way to approach it, because it can get a little murky when you start having to look at what you had previously versus what you have upon May 25th. So it's just kind of it's a unique piece that unique initiative that you could enact.
Okay. And then a couple follow-ups again on applicability. I know that's been a big theme today. These questions are kind of similar, so I'll ask them together. So if a U.S. citizen, what is the applicability? Is it to the person or where the transaction occurred? So in other words, if we have a U.S. citizen simply on vacation in the EU, they're a credit union member, and they use I'm assuming their Visa card or an ATM, whatever it is, or have transactions in the UK, does that make the credit union, does that pull them within the scope of GDPR compliance?
No, so it's actually, the best way to look at it is the other way is the scope. So if you have an EU resident or citizen on vacation in the US and they utilize the service, that actually could put you in scope. That's kind of the best way to kind of look at the potential broadness of the scope of GDPR. Now, again, I think there's always going to be the question on how enforceable is that really going to be if someone comes over, but that is by and large how far-reaching the applicability scope is. So yeah, it wouldn't necessarily matter because they are a U.S. resident going into the EU, but if an EU resident or citizen does come over to the United States, that would put you into scope at this point.
Okay, great. And then I think you made reference to a specific ISO on the prior slide, but the final question we have here on the list is, are there any recommended tools or frameworks for data mapping and getting that process going?
Yeah, so let me go back real quick. It's 22306. Oops, there it is. Sorry about that, everyone. So it's ISO 22307. And it's actually focused on the financial sector as well. So that's a good one.
Okay.
If you're also looking for other just kind of like risk-based frameworks, ISO 27001 and ISO 27018, which is cloud and privacy, if you're heavily invested into the cloud, are other good frameworks to kind of help establish more of that risk-based approach. But if anyone does have any questions specifically about that and conducting it, please do. Again, my information as well as Brian's, and actually my managing director, Christina Whiting, our information is in there. We'd be happy to just quickly go over any any questions you have specifically about conducting those privacy impact assessments.
Yeah, and I know we're short on time here. I think one of the questions that that didn't get asked, but I've been getting a lot of questions about, David, is enforceability. You know, if you're a U.S.-based institution and you know, you've got, let's say, a limited footprint like most credit unions do, you know, we don't have any precedents, of course, for this, but you know, what's the likelihood or what's the enforceability of, you know, them trying to create a lawsuit or however it would be pursued here in the United States on behalf of GDPR?
Yeah, so, and it's a great question. I think, you know, like everything with GDPR, and I know it gets a little annoying to hear this, but we're going to have to see what happens as things continue to shake out. There are international law precedents that do, you know, basically enable cooperation between, you know, different countries and organizations to be able to do business with those countries and those citizens. So there have been establishments of that, and part of that is if there is some type of an enforcement ruling that you're supposed to comply and cooperate with it to the best of your ability. I think we're going to see how specifically with GDPR that works. But there is some guidance on that. There is international law precedent that is in place. So those would be worth looking at. But again, I think we're going to really have to see how all of those specific pieces kind of come to the surface in the next few months.
Perfect. That's all I have. Thank you very much. Great content.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And again, we will send out an email with this PDF just so you guys can have this as reference. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Christina or Brian specifically. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.